Good morning, everyone. May I have your attention, please? We're ready to get started. If I could have everyone's attention, please. We're ready to get started. It is 9:30 on the dot. Welcome to today's Council on Foreign Relations Symposium. We have members and guests in Washington, D.C., as well as on Zoom, so welcome one and all. We hope you enjoy all of our sessions today. A reminder that today's symposium is on the record. If you're joining in person, please check your cell phones and silence them. That would be much appreciated. If you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A and you're here in person, raise your hand. If the presider calls on you, please stand, wait for the microphone, introduce yourself, and ask your question. You can also ask a question if you're joining via Zoom. Just click on the raise hand icon on the Zoom window. If you hear your name being called out, just accept the unmute now prompt. Your video will remain off, but your microphone will be unmuted so everyone on Zoom and in the room in DC can hear your question. Just introduce yourself and ask your question. Again, all sessions are on the record. Thank you, everyone.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Mike Froman. I'm president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and it's a great honor to welcome you here all today to our symposium on securing Ukraine's future. About 6 months ago, the Council launched a special initiative on securing Ukraine's future, led by Senior Fellow Paul Stairs. The initiative is really focused on 3 areas: achieving peace, how can a just and durable peace deal be reached; preparing for and realizing Ukraine's economic reconstruction and recovery, what needs to be done to boost economic growth and rebuild critical infrastructure; and thirdly, building a framework for Europe's long-term security. In these areas, as well as the state of play in Ukraine, those will drive the issues of today's symposium. In a moment, we'll play a short video that explains some of our work in this area, but before we do, I'd like to provide just a little framing context. Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine just marked its 3rd anniversary, just a week ago, and President Trump is determined to bring a swift end to the conflict. Needless to say, we are meeting at a particularly dynamic time for the situation in Ukraine and the relationship of the United States to that conflict. And as a response to that dynamism, we have a full day of sessions in store for you, including this morning's keynote address on the path to peace in Ukraine, Ukraine and the future of European security, and reconstructing Ukraine. It's in that spirit that I have a great privilege of introducing this morning's speaker for the keynote discussion, General Keith Kellogg, Assistant to the President and Special Presidential Envoy for Ukraine and Russia. He previously served as the National Security Advisor to former Vice President Mike Pence and Chief of Staff and Executive Secretary of the National Security Council in the first Trump administration. And our presider this morning is Margaret Brennan, the moderator of Face the Nation and the Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent for CBS News. We're also lucky to have her as a member of the CFR Board of Directors. After the introductory video, General Kellogg will come up to the podium, give some framing remarks on Ukraine's path towards peace. Then Margaret will come up and moderate a session with him before taking questions from all of you. We also have about 300 people on Zoom. And after that, we'll move to a panel on Ukraine and the future of European security to discuss how the war has upended the region's security and how the NATO alliance might evolve. All of this is made possible with the support of the Wachenheim Program on Peace and Security, and we're very grateful to the Susan and Edgar Wachenheim for their support of the Council more broadly. I'd like to remind you that today's discussion is on the record, and with that, we'll turn to our introductory video. Thanks for joining us this morning.
More than 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the conflict has devolved into a war of attrition. The war has exacted a heavy toll on the Ukrainians and the Russians alike. Hundreds of thousands of Russian and Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or wounded. Millions of Ukrainian civilians have been killed or displaced. Ukraine's infrastructure, from residential buildings to the energy sector, has been damaged or destroyed. Against all odds, Ukraine has prevented Russia from achieving its initial objectives and maintains control over hundreds of square kilometers of Russian territory after a surprise offensive in the Kursk region last summer. But Russia continues to occupy some 20% of Ukraine, making significant gains late last year. now, Ukraine's future and the broader transatlantic security relationship is in question.
Say this, I believe I will be able to make a deal between President Putin and President Zelensky quite quickly.
Here at home, President Donald Trump has promised to deliver a quick end to the war. The United States has benefited from the order and stability that's existed across Europe for the greater part of the last century. But questions abound about the United States' role as Europe's security guarantor and the future of economic and military assistance to Ukraine. At the same time, Europe has struggled to find its footing and step up to not only defend Ukraine, but provide for its own long-term security. A secure, sovereign, and prosperous Ukraine grounded in the West is in our interests. Losing Ukraine would undercut the strength of the transatlantic alliance and encourage adversaries to take actions against U.S. partners. It would also mark the first victory for the emerging axis of autocracies. There's never been a more critical time to inform U.S. engagement on Ukraine than now. That's why we've launched the Council's Special Initiative on Securing Ukraine's Future, led by Senior Fellow Paul Stairs, to analyze the various challenges the U.S., Europe, and Ukraine must overcome to end the war. The initiative focuses its efforts on the following issues. Achieving peace. How can a just and durable peace deal be reached? What are the necessary conditions for all parties? How can the United States best facilitate that peace? Preparing for and realizing Ukraine's reconstruction and economic recovery. What does Ukraine need to boost its economic growth and rebuild its critical infrastructure? How can this be achieved? What external support is needed? Building a framework for Europe's long-term security. How can Ukraine be integrated into the European framework? What does Europe need to do to deter Russian aggression in the future? What will the U.S. role be in the continent's security architecture? Since its inception in 2024, the Special Initiative has convened meetings with top experts and policy officials and commissioned actionable policy reports that provide innovative solutions for the conflict's most complex challenges. We've already seen the direct impact of our work. In 2025, we plan to continue this momentum. Securing Ukraine's future is not just about strategizing an end to the war within the next 12 months. It requires looking past the cessation of hostilities to tackle the long-term economic and security challenges for Ukraine, Europe, and the United States. In the months and years ahead, we hope you'll engage with us on this effort.
Well, thank you to the Council and President Froman for the invitation to speak to you today. And thank you to the audience for joining this conversation. I see some friends in the audience that have been here before, Elliot, Doug, the rest of the team out there. And today I think we're going to be discussing what is arguably the most complex foreign policy challenge the administration is faced with, and that's ending the Russian-Ukraine war, the largest war in Europe since the end of World War II. President Trump recognizes this and has acknowledged the gravity and complexity of bringing peace to this war. In a December press conference at Mar-a-Lago, President Trump remarked that ending the Russia-Ukraine war would be, quote, even more difficult than resolving the ongoing Israeli-Hamas war and the turmoil in the Middle East, end quote. President Trump's assessment is well-founded. The Russia-Ukraine war has become the largest land war in Europe since World War II. The death and destruction is what could be called industrial grade. After 3 years of war, combined casualties on both sides have surpassed 1 million individuals. Think of it this way. Just on the Ukrainian side alone, more soldiers have been killed, the Ukrainians, than the United States lost in the Vietnam War and the Korean War combined. Russia has over 490,000 soldiers deployed to Ukraine, a force that is larger than today's active United States Army. Russia has destroyed Ukrainian cities like Mariupol, a city the size of Denver proper. The city of Izium, a city that I visited, a city of 70,000, now holds less than 20,000, where when I was there, cooking was done in the streets because of no electrical power. The hospitals were running on generators. Russia's actions have been a catalyst for a broader crisis throughout Europe, to include ongoing refugee, energy security, food scarcity, inflation, and defense readiness issues across the entire continent. I've seen the destruction of Russia's war firsthand, having visited Ukraine, including the Donbass region. While the kinetic action and direct military engagement of this war is bound to Russian and Ukrainian territory, this war is ultimately being waged by a competing alliance structure who are all proxies to this war. Russia's war effort has led to a deepening of alliances with the Chinese, the Iranians, and North Koreans, where the Europeans are supporting Ukraine by proxy, in a simple fear that if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, the war will spill over to the rest of Europe. Recently, spending 3 days at the recent Munich Security Conference talking to them, their fears and concerns look palpable. So when we discuss the complexities of ending this war, it comes from an understanding that bringing this war to a conclusion not only requires mitigating the root causes of the Russia-Ukraine war itself, but it ultimately entails the United States and European allies confronting a global adversarial alliance structure. Our allies in Europe claim they will pick up any slack in support, but also openly proclaim that the United States must be involved. In this foreign policy crisis, President Trump has been clear that the United States' primary objective in this war is to stop the killing and get both sides to the table and implement an enduring peace structure. America has funded this war with over $170 billion. This year alone, with the most recent tranche of over $60 billion, is an amount larger than we funded the United States Marine Corps this year. Donald J. Trump is a peacemaker, and he is a president of peace. President Trump has committed to the American people that he will put the interests and security of our citizens first, and he will keep our nation out of endless wars. You know, I'm reminded of what Professor Paul Kennedy from Yale University wrote in a seminal work, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. When he noted that great powers historically fail when they involve themselves in strategic overreach. He called it imperial overreach. But I'll make it simple so you don't have to buy the book. When a nation is concerned about filling somebody else's potholes, then their own potholes, they fail. Ushering in peace between nation states was the legacy of his first administration. And this is the same mission he is bringing into the second administration and towards this war. This war did not start on Donald Trump's watch. I believe he's absolutely right. It would not have started if he was in office, and the strategy of the previous administrations, as much as it takes, as long as it takes, to me, was not a strategy, but a simple bumper sticker. Despite the past, President Trump is working hard to bring a peaceful resolution to this war. You can see the high priority he is placing on this goal when you look at how many senior individuals he has asked to pitch in and help negotiate peace, from Marco Rubio to Howard Lutnick, to Scott Bessler, to me, to Mike Waltz. He has worked out more in the last 45 days than we saw in the previous years. And we've only been at it for 45 days. But we already have teams in Moscow and in Kyiv. And we all want the same thing. We are working as a team to explore every avenue we can for peace. But as we know, and as this administration knows, peace is only possible through strength, which brings us to where we are today. How the Trump administration is deploying strength in this urgent moment to bring a peaceful resolution to this devastating war. To start, President Trump's America First approach towards engagement abroad is a driving force behind this administration's approach to the war, which is notably different than the preceding administration and the broader U.S. foreign policy establishment and status quo approach to the U.S. national security apparatus. President Trump has already engaged President Putin. He's engaged President Zelensky. We have found from previous approaches, you cannot avoid talking to your adversaries or friends alike. President Trump has elevated the United States priority as bringing peace to both sides rather than framing this war as one side winning over the other, an approach would only serve to drag America into an endless proxy war to the detriment of our own national security interests. When President Trump was asked in May 1923 2023 town hall if he wanted, quote, Ukraine or Russia to win this war. He responded by saying, I just want everybody to stop dying. This statement was not only a public commitment to peace and a commitment to keep our nation out of an endless war, but it was a proactive signal that the United States would serve as a positive force in bringing a resolution to this conflict. We saw this very approach towards that war play out in the recent Oval Office meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky last Friday. And I had a ringside seat, standing right behind the Vice President and Secretary Rubio. What happened was two nation-state leaders coming into a meeting with objectives that were clearly not in alignment with one another. And there was a disconnect publicly between the goals of the two administrations. President Zelensky approached this engagement with President Trump as an effort to get the United States to co-sign on the U.S. to continually funding Ukraine, to give Ukraine an advantage over Russia. President Zelensky clearly wanted President Trump to side publicly with the United States against Russia. It would have negated an objective interlocutor role. President Trump, however, was not approaching as a matter of one side gaining an advantage over the other, but was instead focused on peace, stating, quote, President Zelensky is not ready for peace if America is involved because he believes our involvement gives him a big advantage in negotiations. I don't want advantage, I want peace, end quote. There is the human cost of this war which deeply resonates with President Trump. The casualties of this war have surpassed 1 million. And on an average, this war is costing an average of 600 soldiers killed in action per day. Short of U.S. efforts to end this war and stopping the killing, Ukraine is quickly approaching the lost generation. That is a term that Britain used and experienced from the bloody trench warfare in World War I. Just about a year ago, at this time, I was with President Trump as we traveled on a campaign trip to Iowa, and we discussed the war. He is not new to the issue of conflict resolution. He understands the damages of war and what it brings. And I just returned from Ukraine, where I did a visit to a Ukrainian military hospital in Irpin, where you see physically the toll that this prolonged war has had on the Ukrainian soldiers. One item became very clear, is the urgent need to stop the killing. The visit to Irpin, one that treats soldiers with combat-related amputations, was both uplifting and depressing. Uplifting in seeing soldiers recovering from grievous injuries with a positive attitude, yet at the same time depressing because their physical losses were absolutely catastrophic. This is where President Trump is coming from. He sees the war from both a human dimension and from an American strategic view. There is also a broader strategy at play in President Trump's approach to this war that is informed by the realization that the United States needs to reset relations with Russia. Not engaging with both allies and adversaries is essential in diplomacy. In the previous administration, a mistaken approach was taken in which the United States failed to engage with Russia and leveraged strong diplomacy coupled with credible deterrence to end the war. Nation-state leaders, particularly during times of war, have a primary duty to engage in direct diplomacy with each other and exhaust every lever of statecraft to resolve conflicts and keep our nation out of endless wars. For the President of the United States to not engage with a leader at war has had immense ramifications for our national security. The continued isolation and lack of engagement with the Russians as the war in Ukraine continued is no longer a viable or a sustainable strategy, and is certainly not a responsible approach diplomatically for the United States to continue. These reasons, the human cost of this war, the need to reset relations with Russia to secure Americans' vital national interest, and ultimately to stop U.S. entanglement in an endless proxy war are the driving reasons why President Trump's approach and the framing of this war is distinct from the broader conventional approach that we see publicly to the war. So what you are seeing now and what you're witnessing are urgent efforts by the Trump administration to bring both sides to the table in order to get to a peace settlement. And bringing both sides to the table means applying pressure points and incentives, sticks and carrots, on both sides to get them to the table and agree to peace terms. There are aggressive movements from the administration underway to apply pressure points towards the Russians and obviously to the Ukrainians as well. The seizing of frozen Russian sovereign assets to rebuild and rearm Ukraine, maximum pressure sanctions on Russian energy are a few of the tools the president is leveraging to get Russia to a peace deal. Look at the current sanctions, especially against the Shadow Fleet, that carries 70% of the oil, illicit oil, that comes out of Russia. We sanctioned those vessels by name. 70% of that oil comes through the Baltic Sea. The president has been clear that all options are on the table to end this war. For Ukraine, the president is also applying both pressure points and incentives to get Ukraine to the table. The critical minerals deal is an important part of this effort to get Ukraine to the table. And President Trump approaches diplomacy and engagements in a very transactional manner, with economics as the foundation and driving force behind international affairs in President Trump's America's first, quote, transactional diplomacy, end quote, model. The transactional diplomacy approach is why, in his discussions with foreign leaders, is the first question them is often to ask, as I found the very first time we were in the cabinet room when a foreign official came in, the comment was, quote, what is the trade imbalance between our two nations? That is the same underpinning of the proposed critical minerals deal between the United States and Ukraine. It sets a foundation in which the United States can receive a direct return on its investment in Ukraine. The United States has been Ukraine's leading partner in supporting Ukraine's defensive war from Russia to the extent of over $170 billion. This deal, the critical minerals deal, in one sense, is a mechanism in which the American taxpayer can begin to be recuperated from the costly financial sustainment of this war. More broadly, however, this critical minerals deal also offers a partnership deal between the United States and Ukraine, which can underpin a security architecture for Ukraine going forward. If the United States has direct economic interest in Ukraine, then the United States has a direct and vested interest to protect its economic interests as well, which serves, in fact, as a de facto guarantee, a security guarantee for Ukraine. You will continue to see strong efforts from the United States to bring both sides to the table in order to reach an enduring and sustainable peace effort. We are at the early stages, and very candidly, the road will be bumpy. All peace negotiations are. But failure to end this war, now over 3 years old, could be consequential, not just in Europe, but the world as well. And thank you for having me, and I await your questions and the discussions.
Thanks to all of you for joining this morning, and thank you for your remarks.
Thanks.
For all of you here, we're going to have about 25 minutes of conversation before we open it up to questions from all of you. So this meeting is on the record, and I see my fellow reporters in the gathering here. There are a lot of very specific questions. I know you don't want to talk in specific terms, but we have seen just such a flurry of news in the past 24 to 48 hours from the administration, including the CIA director just yesterday going on Fox News and announcing that intel sharing with Ukrainians was being cut off. My network, CBS, is reporting that's all intelligence sharing, including targeting data for U.S.-provided weapons like HIMARS. There is some defensive intelligence being allowed for Ukrainians to protect themselves. Last night, European Command also issued a statement to CBS saying that there is a pause to security assistance to Ukraine, including what was already in train from the Biden administration. So that's on top of the pause of the $3.85 billion that President Trump just issued. What is the intention here? What is the specific ask that Ukraine has to deliver on for all of this to be lifted?
Margaret, I believe, and thanks for the question. I believe the push is to get them to engage in diplomatic activities give us their, for lack of a better term, their term sheet, to get this to the table and say this is an approach to going forward. We know that both sides are going to have disagreements and agreements as well. So I think it's like a forcing function that you want to get there. It's sort of like, the Russians may say, well, for you to get involved in the talks, we want you to sell us Alaska back. That probably won't happen. But the same thing is going to be with the Ukrainians. So it's more of anything. It's a forcing function to get to the realization that we want to go to a peace discussion, a peace deal. Look, my experience in the reading of history and studying the Russian war. In fact, there's a great book by Russian War by a guy named Alexander Wirth that it comes right down to it. The one thing you never want to do with the Russians is get into an attrition war. I mean, this is the same nation that in World War II lost 70,000 troops dead in Stalingrad in 6 months and continued to fight. So you have to kind of think about how do they look, how do we want to go to, and you don't want to get into a war like that. So again, bottom line, it's a forcing function to get them to the table.
But that's a pretty major concession to Russia to constrain Ukraine's ability to target and hit Russian forces. This pressure really seems to be directly impacting potentially what they can do on the battlefield.
Yeah, but this is one of those, very candidly, they brought it on themselves, the Ukrainians. What I mean by that, look, when we were in the Oval Office last week on Friday, and I'll kind of give you the background a little bit of it. When we talked with President Zelensky before that meeting, there were 13 U.S. senators at Hay Adams. And we said, okay, this is like stage managing. This is what you want to say. It's basically going to come in. We have a precious metals deal. You're going to sign the deal. You're going to have lunch, have a press conference, exit stage right, and you're good to go. We continue to go. What happened became a very combative press conference that went on for almost, 50 minutes. That caught everybody a little bit by surprise. And I was, right there. And I think what happened is they said, wait a second, this is not what we thought this was going to be. You don't negotiate peace discussions in public. You don't try to challenge the President of the United States in the Oval Office that, in fact, you need to side with me and not the Russians. You don't become an independent interlocutor if you look at something like that. And he was forewarned. It's not like President Zelensky was not made aware that this is what we wanted out of the Ukrainians, to basically say, go here, it sets the next stage, it opens up, it goes forward. So I don't blame the President of the United States at all. I think he made a decision, as he is the Commander-in-Chief under Article 2, Section 2, that he wanted to do. And it's sort of like saying, okay, if this is where you want to go, we're going to play it real politics.
So President Zelensky has at least twice now said, though, that he is willing to sign that deal, that he left the White House without signing after he was kicked out. He's also offered some public remarks that seem somewhat contrite, conciliatory. What does he need to do to turn the intelligence and weapons back on? Or is that off the table entirely? Is the U.S. position now that we do not support Ukrainian military operations against Russia?
No, look, I'll give the second part of the question first. Is look what President Trump said in the State of the Union. He was very magnanimous. He was very magnanimous in the Oval Office. And it's very clearly, he's going to, basically there's a pause. He didn't say it was over. He said it was a pause. Of it. And
how long is the pause?
Well, here's where, and I'll answer the first part of the question now, because it's a great question. Look, my experience working with him is, it's sort of like if all of you have a contract. You sign a contract for a car, for a house. Before you go forward, you have a signed contract. And part of it now is, okay, sign. The reason he came to the White House was to sign a document that was going to say, this is us going forward. It's not signed. My point would be, and my personal belief would be, you don't move forward until you get a signed document, period. When we get a signed precious metals deal, and he had an option to do that when I was in Ukraine, and they didn't do it. They had the option to do it last week and didn't do it. I wouldn't do anything until we said signed document.
But he's offering to do it.
Pardon?
He is offering publicly, at least, to do it.
There's a difference between offering to do it and doing it.
What's the holdup now?
Sign the document.
Can he docu-sign it? Can he email it? These things,
That's a great question.
because that seems pretty quick to resolve.
But it's like, you know, who was going to sign it? It was Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's the chief diplomat in Sibilia from Ukraine, or is it, you know?
Is that where we are now? It's the protocol that's being negotiated?
I think the protocol is you sign a document, and once you sign the document that you want to go forward, that you're serious about it, then I think you can move forward. And I think we've seen too many, you know, starts and misses as we go forward on this. And I think that's part of the issue, is how serious are you to get to peace discussions? And you look at the public comments, and you look at the private discussions, and it's one of those, this is over to you. You figure it out. By the way, this is not something that is unusual. When I was in Kyiv 2 weeks ago, I was very clear to President Zelensky the outcome if we didn't have a signed agreement. I was blunt, unclear, that this was a thing that could have happened. Sometimes, and I will be very honest with you, some people always misread the room with President Trump. And you better understand when you play with President Trump where he's going to, and what he's, you know, when he goes for some type of a deal. And what happened is President Zelensky, he misread the room last Friday, and I think he misread what I was telling him when I was in Kyiv as well.
That sounds personal at this point, rather than strategic.
No, well, I think it is strategic. It's not personal at all. I think what it is, it shows a negotiating style. It shows an understanding of what you're presented with. And it's basically that's how negotiations work. Negotiations are a lot of times personal. I mean, when you go back historically, when you look at, you know, negotiations, how they've been solved, they are done personally. You know, go back to what happened in the Treaty of Portsmouth with Teddy Roosevelt, between then the Russians and the Japanese. It was his personal involvement on a personal level that caused the Treaty of Portsmouth to eventually be signed. And I look at it, when you look, I don't care if it's Henry Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho or whoever's out there, they're always personal, but I think there's underlying themes behind them.
But to be clear, once we get through the protocol and the signing of this economic agreement, which is what the Treasury Secretary calls it, not a minerals deal, does the intelligence switch back on?
That's up to the President of the United States.
So it's not necessarily do this and this is the result.
No, it's up to the President of the United States. I am not the President. I didn't get a single electoral college vote. It's up to the President. And he's the Commander-in-Chief, and he's the President. And I would never, ever speak for the President. It's going to be his call.
Well, I'm asking that because it's confusing, frankly. You know, I had the Treasury Secretary on Face the Nation on Sunday, and he had previously described the minerals and economic deal. He said, I was wrong when I called it minerals deal. He said it's an economic partnership deal. But he said that initially was a building block towards peace. After the Oval Office confrontation, he said, now we need peace before we see the economic deal. That was Sunday. I know things change really quickly, and there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen. But what is the position now? It still sounds like it's an open question if U.S. military and intelligence support for Ukraine will ever be turned back on. Is that right?
Well, I look at the word and define the word pause. Pause did not, the President of the United States did not say it is ended. He said it is paused. That is transitional. And he is the one who makes the decisions. No one in the administration, none of us, should ever try to speak for the President. That's his call. And I would leave it up to him to make the decision when he thinks it's equitable or when a pause should be lifted. But to me, Margaret, I think he's got a great team of advisors around him, from Marco Rubio to Scott to Howard to Mike Waltz, to that whole team that you see there. It's a synchronized team. We're all in sync together. We're all talking about it. The lines of communication are open, but we all say, one guy owns this, one guy runs this ship. You know, I'm a Westerner, you know, and a Westerner, you've ever heard the term, you ride for the brand? You know, if you ride for the brand, the trail boss is Donald J. Trump, then you ride for the brand, you're with him.
So you are based, you have an office at the State Department.
And at the White House.
And at the White House. Steve Witkoff, the envoy to the Mideast, is also now involved in the Russia portion of this. He also has an office at the State Department.
And in the White House.
And in the White House. Okay. How much coordination is there between the two of you, or is this completely parallel?
No, Steve's a great guy, and we've got a really good relationship. And and my deputy, John Cole, and Morgan Ortegas are working well together. We talk well together. My offices in the state are on the 7th floor. His are on the 5th floor. I know where his offices are in the White House, and we're in sync together because we understand the importance behind it. And I think what's happened is because the relationship that Steve has on the Russia side, that actually started because of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince in Saudi, and he brought in Kirill Dmitriev, who is the interlocutor with Russia.
He runs the Sovereign Wealth Fund.
And so he brought them together. So it made a lot of sense to strategically say, okay, with Steve, and I'm talking with Steve, is Steve, you run this lane really hard, and I'll run this lane really hard, and we're like this together. We're talking about it, and we're sort of comparing notes that we want to be and providing that. And Marco Rubio made a great point when he was asked about it, because he was asked on a program about in the special envoys. The beauty that Steve and I have is that's all our focus is. I'm focused on this and he's focused on that. We build our teams out that way, and it makes it really good. So that's a long answer to a short question, but Steve and I are in sync. We're together. We talk. We're on speed dial with each other, and our messages are basically coordinated.
So Envoy Witkoff was on Face the Nation recently, and when I was asking him about the 3.5-hour meeting he had with Vladimir Putin, which I think all of us would love to be a fly on the wall for that one, he said he went by himself. There was no foreign service or intelligence officer with him. There were translators. He said 2 in the room. Were those U.S. translators?
I don't know.
When he did that interview...
if you say he didn't have anybody with him, probably not.
That's what he said.
Yeah.
Yeah. So were there notes from that meeting? Is there any record? I wonder, because that's an extraordinary amount of time with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, there were notes that were brought back, that Steve brought back. And so we are aware, it's sort of like a quid pro quo, where you want to go and what you want to do, and the discussions that were made. And
it's their term sheet, essentially?
Well, I use the term sheet, and term sheets, the answer is, yeah, in generalization, but it's like when I say term sheet, that's when I kind of made, obviously it wasn't a bad joke, but the fact is, like, the way they want Alaska back, nope, not going to happen. But we have an indication of where the Russians are, and we want to do the same thing with the Ukrainians as well. And to me, we had a wonderful opportunity to get there.
So
lost it.
Envoy Witkoff said on a different network, but I read the transcript, that the framework for a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia is the Istanbul Protocol Agreement.
Yeah.
Is that the framework you are working with?
No. Here's why. We both work from different, that came out of the Russians, said maybe you go there. To me, when you look at the Istanbul Accords, that happened 30 days after the invasion. And the demands in Istanbul were fairly significant on a very weakened Ukraine. And here's where I will agree with what Steve said. And Steve said it's a departure point. I think that's a good word to use. It's a departure point. At least but I think you have to look at those. I don't believe for all of us that is an equitable framework. And I think we have to develop something entirely new. You can start from that position if you want it with the Russians, but that is going to be something up to the negotiation teams going forward, what they want to look at. And I know that President Erdogan would obviously like to use that as a starting point. But I think any reasonable person has to look at what those accords actually said.
Right.
And you read each one of them quite clearly what was demanded. And I think now when you look at it, even though Ukraine at the time was agreeable to some of the conditions there, you have to look at the time frame when that was done. And that was when the battlefield was in flux. It was 30 days after the start. They were still fighting around Bucha. They were still trying to evict them from Kharkiv, the regions around Kharkiv, and it was a pretty strenuous fight. So you have to go to today. You can't go back 3 years ago.
Yeah, the Institute for the Study of War issued an analysis of that, saying the draft protocol leaves Ukraine helpless in the face of future Russian threats of aggression. It sounds like you agree with that assessment.
Yeah, I think
it said it also restricted any bilateral security agreements. So this is not the Trump administration position.
No, I think Steve made the comment as a general comment. It is not the Trump administration policy because they haven't made their policy. You know, the president said this is where we're going to be because we haven't got to that point yet. We, you know, that's what, you know, I like the term sheet. We know that what the term sheets are going to be, and then you can, you know, pivot from a known point and say, okay, this is where you're at.
In your remarks, you use the phrase "a credible deterrence to end the war." In your mind, and you have a military background, obviously, what does that mean? Because that could be interpreted as a security guarantee.
Yeah, well, I think when you look at it, there's a tendency to default to kinetics. When you talk about a security guarantee, that means 50,000 or 100,000 or 80,000 troops right on the border, right on the line of contact. It is more complete than that. I think you have to look at it when you talk about security guarantees. It's not only the kinetic piece, the military piece, which is clearly important, but it's also the economic piece, the sanctions. What are you doing with the frozen Russian assets? There's $300 billion sitting in Belgium right now. What are you going to use those with? And primarily, that's oligarchs' money.
Do you want to seize that?
Pardon?
Do you want to seize that?
I think you have to have that President Putin needs to understand those assets that can't be seized as long as the Europeans are willing to do it. And that's going to be up to the Belgiques to want to do that. But it's also diplomatic as well. And I think part of this process is it's an unusual process in the sense that we were not confronted with this 4 years ago. You know, when 4 years ago you looked at North Korea, was think of a quad chart. The North Koreans were over here, the Iranians were over here, the Russians, you know, were over here in working that issue, and the Chinese were over here. Well, now they're all together, and they're all together. You actually got a defense arrangement between the Russians and the North Koreans. North Koreans are fighting outside of Kursk right now. I mean, conceptually, you could see that if there's a war in the Korean Peninsula where over 20,000 U.S. troops are, you could see Russian troops fighting because that's part of the agreement. And I said, we weren't confronted with that 4 years. It's a brand new arrangement. And so what President Trump did before is he kept them all segmented. It's sort of like the game of whack-a-mole. That every time a mole would come up, you whack it down. Well, all the moles came up. And now we've got to figure, okay, how do we do this? Nestor made the comment about geostrategically. This is not just a European problem. This is a global problem. And I think we have to approach it that way as well. You can't just isolate Europe. So that's going to be the issues going forward, and I think the president appreciates that. And it's something that we appreciate. Steve does, I do, Secretary of State Rubio does as well. That we've got to manage this, stage manage this in a way that protects U.S. equities into the future.
So does credible deterrence mean that the Trump administration would backstop European peacekeeping forces? That came up in the Oval with the Prime Minister of the UK, and it wasn't clear what the U.S. answer was.
Well, I think that's part of the discussion we're having with the Europeans as well. When you talk about what does backstop look like, to define your terms. You know, I think back in my Jesuit education days when I had a professor that said, always define your terms. I said, that's going to be important. What does it mean? But the Europeans were very clear when I was in Munich. They said, we support Ukraine as long as you're there. And said, well, what does that mean? So I think that's the reason you have to, the diplomatic side, with the presidents and prime ministers and chancellors of Europe, what does that look like? The economic side, what do sanctions look like? What is frozen assets, whatever it's going to be? And then we also look at the military side as well. Look, I made that comment a minute ago. It's pretty interesting to me when you look at it and isolate it to one issue. When you look about the sanctions the U.S. put on, we actually sanctioned the Shadow Fleet by Hull.
Sorry, the Shadow Fleet, are you talking about the sanctions on Iran?
No, the Shadow Fleet was the fleet that carries the illicit oil coming out of Ukraine. That's going to some of our allies out there, like India.
From Russia.
From Russia. And 70% of the illicit oil is, in fact, going through the Baltics on that fleet. We have sanctioned each individual ship by name. USS Kellogg, USS Smith, whatever it is out there. In 2018, 2019, we did something very similar with the North Koreans. we actually sanctioned their fleet that was moving coal from Korea to China. And we used U.S. Coast Guard assets. And we've got 10 world-class cutters that can do that. You actually start interdicting the fleet, and there's ways to do that with the allies. And you start setting that down. And those are kind of things that you do economically that would really make everybody understand, stand up and say, okay, they're serious about this. Bring them to the table. This is what you're going to do. But those are the kind of options that we have to have.
So is putting further sanctions on Russia an option at this point?
Well,
Because we haven't heard, at least, that they've been offering any concessions.
you know, Margaret, it's not so much more options, it's the enforcement of the options. I think what's happened when you look at, if you ranked order the sanctions, I think if it was between 1 to 10, we're probably at a 7. The problem is with enforcement, we're probably at a 3. And so that's where I keep going back to that one to kind of make a point. If you're serious about the sanctions and you do it, not only the Russian sovereign assets, but there's other things that you can do if you want to do it as allies to do it. And by the way, some of the allies are actually doing that in the Baltics. They're actually intercepting some of those vessels. Now, people come out and say, well, there's international laws, there's international rules, and it's, but you can seize or board some of those vessels to kind of make the point. So the sanctions are there. I think the most important thing is the enforcement of the sanctions, not necessarily the sanctions themselves.
You think the Trump administration needs to enforce sanctions against Russia more strongly, or you're
Well,
saying
I
other
think,
countries?
I think we recognize the opportunity to do so, and I would remind everybody, the war's been going on for 3 years. We've been in office for 45 days. You know, kind of okay. We kind of know where we're at. We're trying to figure it out, and this is where we're going.
I want to take some questions from those in the audience as well. But as we gather those, can you quickly tell us what is in the economic partnership deal at this point?
Well,
Have the terms changed?
The deal, you know, when we talk about, and you know, I'm going to be honest with you, you know, if a precious metal hit me in the face, I probably wouldn't know what it was, but I do know what they are. And I think part of it is just not only oil infrastructure, but the rebuilding of that infrastructure. But also you're looking about some precious metals. And I'll use titanium as an example. You know, titanium is, they export it, we import it. And it's designed for a lot of things that we use in the defense establishment. And the ability to reach and to use those. And here's the thing, and when I was talking to the president about it, I said, one of the things we probably ought to do before we really lock ourselves down is get the U.S. Geological Service to actually inventory that. Because the last time that those precious metals were even inventoried were done in the Soviet days. So you're kind of taking a little bit of a leap of faith in what's actually out there. We do know that it's called the Ukrainian Crescent, and it's on the western part of the Dnieper River, that there's a huge crescent of those precious metal areas that are there. Some of them are also, by the way, in Russian territory, Russian-occupied territory now. And part of it, I think the most important is, it's an economic security deal. And what I mean by that, and we tried to get across to President Zelensky and his team, look, when you get involved economically with somebody, I don't care if it's setting up McDonald's hamburger franchises or the precious metals, you invest yourselves diplomatically, militarily, economically, in the future of this country. And that's what we're trying to get across to them. That, look, this is something that is a big deal for us because President Trump is a transactional leader, and transactional starts with economics. And so we thought this was a good start for Ukraine and for an alliance that will continue to build with the United States and Ukraine.
Michael Gordon here in the front row has the first question here in Washington.
Thank you. Michael Gordon, Wall Street Journal. Sir, you're a retired Army general and you're familiar with the battlefield situation in Ukraine. What is the concrete effect of the abrupt end of military resupply to Ukraine and the end of the provision of intelligence and targeting data? The Ukraine may take some time for their military supplies to run down, but the cutoff in intel does have an immediate effect. In your judgment, what's been the effect to date, and what's going to be the effect if it continues for another week or 2 or 3?
Well, Michael, thanks for the question. I think the best way I can describe it is sort of like hitting a mule with a 2x4 across the nose. You got their attention, and it is significant, obviously, because of the of the support that we give, okay? But it's one way to sort of get your attention to do it. But it's a pause. It's not an end. And it's then up to them to do it. And I know that the allied partners that has anything to do with U.S. support as well are kind of paused as well. So anytime as a military person, anytime you displace assets, primarily from the intelligence community, it's pretty significant. And I'll use unclassified reports. There are certain reports that allow certain aircraft that allows people to see deep, that we basically said this is unclassified reports on the news that have been withheld out there. So it's like, okay, what do we see with their aviation assets, the Russian aviation assets? What does it mean? And I think that's important. But it's sort of like, okay, we're trying to get your attention. Okay, this is serious. This is what the support means. They understand it. You know, we had John Ratcliffe's counterpart, Malyuk, was here last week. He knows, Ratcliffe knows. I made it very clear when I was in Kyiv, the potential for this. It was almost like, well, okay, we hear you. Well, okay, no, we're serious. We're deeply serious about this. And it's not to let them know that it wasn't that we're not serious. We let them know that this president is very serious about it, and we're going to end this war. And this is one way to make sure you understand we're serious about it. So is it hard? Of course it is. But they didn't. It's not like, Michael, it's not like they didn't know this was coming. They got fair warning it was coming. I told them, and they were told last week as well.
It sounds like you're saying there is going to be a significant impact on the battlefield. Do they have enough gear to get them until the summer?
I think we're okay. I think the pipelines, you know, they have an ability with the assets they've got to continue to prosecute the fight, to do it. But let's be obvious. Let's be clear about it. I mean, as a military person, I don't care who you're supporting. I don't care if it's Uganda or Rwanda or whomever. If you take away support like that, of course it's important. We know that. But that's one of the reasons why it was done. It's almost like, you know, can I give you an example, a personal example? And, you know, I've got 2 granddaughters, and their nickname for me is Pop Pop, okay? And sometimes when I talk to them, I'll stray. You know, I'll go, and they grab me like this, and they say, Pop Pop, listen to me. Okay, this is one of those, listen to me. We're serious about this. And you need to understand we're serious about this. And this is one of the ways we made sure they understood. And I think as a result of that, they realize we're serious. And they need to get serious about it as well. You know, that Michael, and to go back a week, that 50 minutes in the Oval Office was entirely preventable. President Trump was very magnanimous in that for the first 30 minutes. I'd ask you to go back and look at the tape, not once, but 2 or 3 times, and everything he did. And that went, as the term is, that went south real quick.
Mm-hmm. Jill here in the center of the room.
Thank you very much, General Kellogg. Jill Doherty from Georgetown University. I wanted to ask you about Russia. I believe you said that the administration has seen a change in Moscow. Could you define exactly what that change is? Because at least publicly, it appears that President Putin has the same demands now that he had 3 years ago, which would be essentially territory. They keep what they've got, even if they don't hold it. Zelensky goes, and no NATO. And there are probably others. But can you tell us specifically what is the change in Moscow?
Yeah, you know, it's a great question, because I think what you want to do, you have to, you know, I think leaders have to talk with one another. And President Biden didn't talk to Putin for over 2 years. President Trump has. So starting the changes, we're talking. That doesn't sound like much, but it's important that you've got leaders talking. The second is, of course, they're going to make their term sheet large. That's the reason I made that comment about who knows what they're going to ask about, but that's a starting point. It's not an end point. You know, I go back at the start of the SALT negotiations years ago when I asked the leaders who were running the SALT negotiations. Ed Rowney was one of the guys who led that. And he said, understand how you negotiate with the Russians. You know, when you come into a room, 2 doors, you come into a room. You know, Americans come into a room and negotiate, we walk halfway across the room. The Russians come in, they stand on the side of the wall. So what do the Americans do? We go we go another quarter way across the room. And we understand how they negotiate. We know what's going to happen. But the fact is that their talking is very, very important. And I think that's the first step. So when you say there's a change, they're willing to talk about it. And I think, so it's not necessarily what the terms and conditions are. Look what President Trump has said about that. I mean, he's been pretty good about what he said. He said basically all options are on the table for the United States where it wants to go. And he's made that very, very clear to President Putin when he talked to him, and when Steve Witkoff talked to him as well. So I think the very fact that you're starting to talk is important, because you don't know where they're at until you get that term sheet. And I think we've got a preliminary. We kind of know where they're coming from and knowing what they want to do. We kind of need the same from the Ukrainians. And then you kind of put them together and you say to the president, our president, okay, Mr. President, this is what it looks like right now. This is what the picture looks like. Now, this is where we think, as a team, this is where we think that you can give and take and where you want to go. So are we down to the absolute end state? No. But remember what President Trump said. He actually talked about the potential of getting territory back from the Russians. He said that. That's a public comment from him. So
which territory?
Pardon?
Can you tell
he
us
didn't say. It's almost like, you know, remember the president said he was going to end the war in 24 hours. We didn't say what day, what year. So I think this is good that they're talking, and I think both sides talking is very, very important to get there. And look, this is, let's be very, very candid about it. There's no love lost between Ukraine and Russia right now. But this war is a war that, and I've been over there, I mean, the loss of humans is critical. And in fact, by the way, and the reason I know I'm diverting just for a bit on that is, I actually talked to President Trump on the campaign trail well over a year ago, and we talked about this thing, the lost generation. It's real. If you look at the demographics of Ukraine, I can show you where the demographics on the loss of military-aged men, at this time 25 to 35 years old, has gone down considerably. Plus the amount of people that have left their country right now, middle-aged men, military-aged males as well. And we're talking over 100,000. And so the Brits still feel that. They still talk about the lost generation. We don't want Ukraine to be in that position where you've got a lost generation. But again, it's a long answer to a short question. The fact is, we're kind of getting the broad parameters of where the Russians are looking at, what they want to do. The president will see that. But you got to get both. You got to say, okay, this is what it looks like. Okay, this is the ground view. And then put it together and say, okay, where do you think this is going to go from both sides? And we expect the Russians to be here. We expect the Ukrainians to be here. We want them to be here in this to end this war. And there's long-term benefits for everybody, for not only the stability of Europe, but it's for us to, at a geostrategic level, it's a chance to break up this axis that we currently see that is global in nature, which is a real threat to the United States of America.
Carrie had a virtual question, I think.
We'll take the next question from Stephen Pfeiffer.
Thanks very much, General, for the discussion here. Steve Pfeiffer, I'm affiliated with Stanford University and a former American ambassador to Ukraine. Sir, you talked about carrots and sticks. It does seem like the United States is applying some very heavy sticks against Ukraine with the cutoff of intelligence and the suspension of arms. Can you talk a little bit more, though, about the sticks we're applying on Russia? Because at least publicly, the Russians seem to be the much more recalcitrant party with a very inflexible negotiating position. You mentioned sanctions on shadow tankers. Has the Trump administration sanctioned additional tankers? You said something about seizing assets. Are we now moving to seize the Russian frozen bank assets? But what are the sticks we're trying to apply on Moscow to get Russia to become more accommodating? Because right now it does look like we're leaning pressure really on the Ukrainians, but not on the Russians. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. Okay, and I'd challenge you with this. And it's almost a binary, it's a question with a binary answer. Do we have a term sheet from the Russians broadly? And do we have a term sheet from the Ukrainians? The answer is yes and no. So when you look at applying the pressures, we understand the pressures, but we kind of understand the pressures we can apply. Again, I remind everybody, we've only been at this for 45 days to get there, but we know what we can apply pressures where they want to go to. But they reached out fairly fast. Steve Witkoff went to Moscow, was able to talk with Putin for 3 hours. There was a call that was made between President Putin and President Trump. And we offered, when you talk about the pressures, the fact is, when the Ukrainians came last week, they had an invitation to sign a document in the Oval Office, have lunch with, they came to Washington, D.C., had that invite, and frankly, walked out of here with nothing. So I challenge your notion about who's being more reasonable right now, because when you look at what is happening, I don't see it the same way. I think that we're going to get there. I think the options are to apply more pressures. I think that's good. I don't think it's been done. But I think the opportunity is there to do it, and that's going to be up to the President of the United States.
Okay. Do we have time for one more, Carrie? Okay. I'm going to go wrap on time up here. But it sounds like you have a lot of people here who want to talk to you. So I'm gonna leave it here for us today. Thank you all virtually for tuning in. Thank you, General Kellogg, as well, for your time and for taking questions. The video and transcript of the symposium will be posted on CFR's website, and you can join for Session 2, Ukraine and the Future of European Security, beginning 15 minutes from now. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you, General.